Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming after lunch to hear me speak. Can you all hear me? Great. So I'm going to talk to you about impact and your legacy, and about my company called Legacy. So I love events, probably like most of you here. I love that feeling when you bring people together in a space and it creates a kind of magic. I think you all know what I'm talking about. And you have that experience that you know that no one outside of that event can really capture, even if they're on social media, and no one will ever have that experience ever again. It's just that magic of an event. And so for me, I find that really special for all kinds of events, for conferences, for festivals. But events also really get on my nerves because they do have a dark side. They're great for bringing people together. They're great for facilitating business transactions, for networking. They're great for the personal joy that events can bring. But we all know they have a dark side. They can be hugely wasteful. 3/4 of the food that gets prepared for events is wasted. That's completely edible food that's just wasted. Every plastic pen, plastic keyring, name badge that you've ever given out at one of your events, that's still here on the planet. It's in landfill or it's in the ocean being taken in by fishes and other sea life, but it's still here. So that's just considering the waste of the events, rather not even considering some of the other impacts. And so that's what Legacy does. We are on a mission to show that events can be just positive without the dark side. And so what we do is we help companies to run events that are positive for the environment and also positive for the community, so positive socially as well. So we work with large companies, small companies, public sector, private sector, to really understand what you can practically do to make your events more sustainable. So some of the companies we've worked with, you might have heard of, like Red Bull, for example, Incisive Media, the University of Brighton, but we work with small clients as well. And for us, it's really important that any advice we give and anything we do is rooted in practicality, because we organize events, and so we realize that any initiatives we talk about, they have to be realistic, as well as good for the planet. So we've taken our years of knowledge and experience and distilled that into 9 themes that we look at whenever we're looking at the impact of an event. And these are the 9 themes. So they're energy and carbon, where we look at the energy use and the subsequent carbon emissions that are coming from an event. We look at the materials, and that's both where you're sourcing the materials from, but also how you're going to dispose of the materials that you're using at an event. We look at the food and drink, massive part of successful events. We look at the well-being, and that's not just the well-being of our delegates, it's the well-being of our speakers and our communities as well. We look at the water use. Water consumption is a huge issue in many parts of the world, including in this country, which surprises people. But the southeast of the UK is actually one of the most water-stressed parts of Europe. We look at transport, so the carbon emissions and the impact of getting people to your events. We look at the effect on the community, so how inclusive are your events? How accessible are they? Do they involve the local community? We look at innovation, so we're really keen on looking at data and feedback to make sure we improve using evidence. And we look at ecology as well, which is often left out, especially with business events, but it's really important in terms of considering your environmental impact. So I'm going to just touch on 3 or 4 of these areas to just give you some examples of what you can do for your events to try and improve the impact in those areas. I'm going to start with materials. Event swag is notorious for single-use items that are not then used again. And so there's a real opportunity there, just considering the materials that you use in the event and that you give away at the event to reduce your impact. So examples of this might be, instead of giving out giveaways, you can perhaps provide what we'd call a virtual tote bag, which is when you have a central area after the event where everyone can upload their presentations and downloadable materials that you want to take from the event. There's an opportunity to brand that as well, make it really aligned with your event goals, and it doesn't create any waste. Anything you procure for your event, whether that's a giveaway, a display material, a banner, anything, there should be a question that you're all asking, which is, what am I going to do with this after my event? That should be something you have as part of your procedures, the same way health and safety is there. Because sometimes you won't be able to do anything with that material and you might have to put it into landfill, but at least you'll have thought about it. At least you'll have thought when you're procuring, what am I going to do with this after the event? Moving on to food and drink. So in June of this year, the UK government released the strategy for the country to say how we're going to reduce all of our emissions down to zero in the next 30 years by 2050. And I'm sure you've all read that really scintillating document. It's several hundred pages long. And as you'll expect with food and drink, it says, no surprises, that we should all be leading a more plant-based diet, which is true. But often we hear from event planners that when they're putting on events, especially for high net worth clients or high profile events, their clients would push back on not being able to eat steak or other types of red meat. So what the UK zero carbon strategy says is A, follow a plant-based diet, but B, if we're really serious about doing something about climate change, we need to cut down our consumption of beef, lamb, and dairy. So that is what you should be focusing on with your events. For those clients who feel that they have perhaps paid a high price for their attendance or really want to eat steak, there are plenty of alternatives to steak. We found, for example, game goes down really well, is much better for the environment, has the same prestige as steak does. So pheasant, partridge, and other type of game items are an alternative perhaps that you can use to beef. Pork is lower emissions than beef as well, so there are options there. We've actually found, and we've been to many events as well that have served vegan, primarily vegan or vegetarian food. And very rarely, I don't think I've ever had any complaints from clients about serving vegetarian food, especially if that client knows why you're doing that. So again, I'd say be brave, be creative. See your food option as a way to enhance the brand, enhance the goals of your events, and to let loose. And the way we primarily burn fossil fuels is we burn them for heating and electricity in our venues, or we burn them in our vehicles to get people to events. And so I just want to touch quickly on energy and carbon and transport, which actually are probably the two biggest contributors to environmental impact of events. However, you do have the power to choose venues that are energy efficient. So that's something that you can try and add within your supplier questions. What is that venue doing to reduce their energy consumption? Within your event itself, spaces like this are great because they have natural daylight, and so you don't need as much artificial lighting to enhance them. So venues with natural daylight are fantastic if you can use those. We all know that events bring people together. Often transport is unavoidable in that, and so often there's an impact with transport. Up to 70% of your event emissions are coming from transporting your delegates there. But just because you're organising an event that people have to come to doesn't mean you can throw up your hands and say, well, I can't do anything about that, so I'll move on. There are things you can do with transport. The very first obvious one is if you have an international event, if you can try and locate your events that involves the lowest amount of travel for all your delegates, that is a quick win, obviously. And I'm not sure if anyone here has seen, but with Skyscanner now and some of the other flight booking websites, you can choose the lower carbon option. So you may have 2 flights that take just about the same amount of time going to the same destination, but you can choose the one that has lower carbon emissions. Instead of having all your delegates drive themselves to your event, perhaps you can put on a shuttle bus for them and keep that branded. PaveGen last year did an event in Brazil, and what they did is they ran shuttle buses where the commentators on the buses gave a little tour of the local area and a briefing about the event. So they incorporated the shuttle ride into the event, and so there was no pushback from delegates because it was part of the experience. Another example is there are several companies in Western Europe and certainly in the UK that now provide electric car taxis. So if your clients insist on being driven by taxis, then at least you can perhaps get them there using Teslas or other similar vehicles. Again, a great brand message. Carbon offsets should be the absolute last thing you should do in terms of offsetting your emissions. It should not be the first, and there are a few reasons for that. The first, very obvious reason, is that with climate change, what we are trying to do is reduce our emissions to zero. We're trying to reduce our impact. And offsetting doesn't reduce your impact, it just displaces it somewhere else. So your impact is exactly the same. And so the first obvious message is that carbon offsetting does not reduce your carbon emissions. The second, especially carbon offset programs that involve growing trees, is that a tree might take 40 or 50 years to grow, and our climate emergency is probably going to be hitting us sooner than 40 or 50 years. So not only are you displacing the problem, you're also displacing it in time as well, so you don't have to deal with it. So again, you're not dealing with the issue. There is a place for carbon offsetting, but as I said, it should be your absolute last resort when you've thought of all your other options. Bringing people together is probably, well, is the best way that humanity has devised for solving big problems. And so my final tip to you all is to use your superpower, use your talent for organizing events to bring people together to try and solve some of these problems. How do you assess the best carbon offset providers? At a very base level, there are standards for carbon offsetting. Come and chat to me afterwards. I can give you a few. As I said, it's the last resort. But generally, with carbon offsetting, what you're looking for is additionality and practicality. So the question is, would this project have gone ahead if I hadn't carbon offset? If it would have gone ahead anyway, then you're not changing anything. You're just contributing to a program that would have gone ahead anyway. So it needs to be a really additional program that would not have gone ahead without your emissions. The second is, what is the carbon being used for? And the sexy option is to plant trees, which we love, but actually some of the most carbon-intensive industries are the less sexy ones, like providing drainage and infrastructure. So look for carbon offset providers that do real practical work in reducing emissions would be my tip. Are my clients talking about the UN SDGs and how do these align with your 9 themes of sustainability? Our 9 themes of sustainability came from our experience, both mine and the teams, in working on improving the environment, the sustainability of the built environment, and also transport. So they're not directly linked with the SDGs, although obviously you can see that there is a link. My clients are talking about the SDGs, but at the moment what I see is clients trying to map their existing activity onto the SDGs. I don't see many clients actually changing their behavior in terms of the SDGs, and so I think they're fantastic, but I'm not sure yet we've seen the power of the SDGs in action. How do I influence my delegates to use sustainable transport if they're paying and organising themselves? Messaging is really key. So if you let your delegates know from the offset that there are sustainable transport options available, then they will be more inclined to use it. So you can organise car sharing, you can organise shuttles, you can also organise green taxis. The other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, try and incorporate your sustainable transport into your event. If you can have local tour guides, if you can have briefing on the sustainable transport, then it becomes part of the experience and clients will be less resistant. And third of all, try not to host your events in places where you need clients to drive themselves individually. If you have a public transport node near you, that helps a lot with that.
Thank you. Hi. I work for a venue in Stockholm in Sweden, and we're quite sustainably minded there. It's part of our DNA. One of the things that we recently tried with an event was nudging. So using nudging, which is a sort of psychological tool, I guess, to make people or influence them to make decisions on their own when it's not really their own decision. So one of the things we did was putting the vegetarian option, instead of having it at the end of a menu, for example, or at the end of a buffet, we would put it first. So people would see that and then already make their mind up, because usually when you look at a menu, you sort of scroll through and then you go back up to see what you forgot. But we put the vegetarian option first, and 70% of our delegates actually chose the vegetarian option, both for day 1 and day 2.
I love that. It's so creative. And it makes complete sense. We all know that the restaurant industry spends millions of pounds trying to get us to choose certain options on their menus. We know it works. We know it works with ourselves when we go to restaurants. So just use that psychology with your events the way you've mentioned. So, yeah.
You've got one more on Glisser. People are now figuring out how to log on.
What are my thoughts on virtual events? This is a really difficult one. Obviously, virtual events are great. However, I'm not sure that you can really replace the power of bringing people together, because bringing people together is not just about them absorbing content. It's about them interacting with other people. However, I don't think that we've really started to see the potential of virtual events yet with some of the social media live streaming that we have, that we're starting to see, which is really powerful. And so I don't think that we're ever going to get away from bringing people together. I think it would be sad if we did. However, I think we should be creative in what we can do with virtual events.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you give her a huge round of applause, please? Abena Poku-Awuah from Legacy.